There are 160 overclocks in Deep Rock Galactic, and in this series I'm testing each and every one to assess its strengths and weaknesses. This time, Engineer is rounding off his arsenal with the LOK-1 Smart Rifle and the Shard Diffractor. First up is SMRT Trigger OS, trademarked. Yes, the trademark is part of the overclock name. This overclock automatically fires once you reach full locks and massively reduces your lock-on time, making it almost instant. In return, you have your maximum locks drastically reduced. This is an awkward overclock that sort of turns the main gimmick of the weapon on its head and turns it into a sort of burst rifle. The problem with this overclock is that you can't control when you shoot, which means you can't curve your shots into weak points that aren't in the center of the enemy's model. Wardens are a great example of why this is a problem, as well as why macro lens is almost unusable with this overclock. I'd highly recommend taking another upgrade in tier 2, it's that much of an interference. As for the overall performance of the gun, it certainly deals a lot of DPS, but it still chews through ammo like crazy, which is a problem when your shots are going to be less effective due to not being able to steer them to the ideal trajectory. This is compounded by the fact that the LOK-1 doesn't have an armor break upgrade, which means a lot of your shots are going to have their damage reduced. It's great against Mactera and for getting behind Praetorians and Oppressors and bursting them down, and it's better for panic firing into crowds, but overall, you need to ration it carefully or you'll be out of ammo before you even realize it. Seeker rounds boosts the angle at which you can maintain locks and makes your shots always hit the target. For reference, that means the shots will phase through terrain and heavy armor that might be in the way. As for whether it ignores light and medium armor too, I'm not sure. The wiki doesn't specify and I couldn't determine whether it did, but it certainly feels like it does at least. It would be odd if it didn't. Anyway, the price to pay for this sure hit is a dramatically reduced burst fire rate and a longer reload. This is a good overclock for people who have difficulty curving the shots properly or just don't want to have to put in the effort. It also makes the gun more reliable and consistent in the heat of a swarm where you may not have the luxury of lining up a curve. Outside of that, the extra lock threshold does make it easier to curve your shots better, so it's not like this overclock is only good for those who are careless. The reload penalty isn't that bad, but the burst rate of fire reduction is something you'll need to keep in mind, especially if you're used to a different LOK-1 build. If you want the gun to be reliable and accurate, this is a good overclock to try. Explosive chemical rounds makes targets with 3 locks explode when shot, either when the last shot locked on the enemy fires or when the shot kills the enemy. In true explosive overclock fashion, this one comes with a damage and ammo penalty. Now right off the bat, I want to recommend either macro lens or the additional lock maximum upgrades for one key reason. When scanning a crowd, the LOK-1 tries to spread locks evenly over all enemies in the scan, meaning if there's too many enemies too close together, you won't be able to get 3 locks on one. You need to learn to use it properly and time the release when an enemy has 3 locks for maximum effect. Not doing that won't harm you much, but lower output in terms of both damage and ammo means you'll really want to try as hard as you can to get the most use out of this to avoid running dry, a constant issue with the LOK-1 in general. It is probably the best wave clear primary build that Engineer has, you just really need to get the hang of it first. Next is the recently buffed Neuro Lasso. This causes your locks to break after a few seconds of being held, but while you're locked on, the targeted enemies are slowed down by a respectable amount. Now in solo play, this isn't very practical. It does give you extra time to line up weak point shots and wait for your locks to fill up, but the general uses are rather minimal. In a co-op game though, this has the potential to be a decent utility option, slowing down a certain enemy or groups of enemies to keep them off your team while your team shoots the enemies, all at no ammo cost to you. This does require some coordination, so it's not amazing or anything, but it's basically a clean in disguise anyway, so there's little to no harm in taking this if you want to play a bit more of a support role or like lining up full locks and want more breathing room to do so. Executioner gives you a quicker lock acquisition and significant weak point damage bonuses on a full lock, but reduces your ammo, mag size, and max locks. This overclock makes the LOK-1 into a powerful single target burst weapon able to chew through tougher targets very quickly. It's not quite as good against swarms, but it's still usable. The mag size penalty isn't that steep, and the ammo penalty is hardly noticeable, just 12 rounds. The one thing I will say though, is that it requires some proactive reloading. The bonus only activates at full lock, and the LOK-1 is prone to have one last burst that is just the leftovers from previous bursts that went unfired due to their target being killed earlier in the burst. This is a problem with the base LOK-1 too, but it's magnified more with this overclock since that's basically built around getting max locks all the time. Despite that, it's still usable without constantly leaning on the bonus, and it is a solid single target DPS weapon in general. Finishing off with the cleans now, Eraser gives you more maximum locks and an increase in mag size. This makes the weapon better at dealing with large crowds and more reliable for shorter bursts. It's also an extra free 12 rounds in your ammo pool, which while not much is still something, I guess. If you find yourself frustrated trying to use this weapon on crowds and never being able to get enough locks on the enemy to kill them, this is a good overclock to try. And lastly, we have Armor Break Module. This clean gives an armor break bonus to all shots at maximum locks. If you're not familiar with why armor break is important, in addition to dealing extra damage to all forms of breakable armor, having any armor break bonus at all makes the shot that breaks light armor deal full damage instead of having the damage reduced by 20% like light armor normally does. Overall, it's not an amazing buff, it is a clean after all, but it's good for loosely firing into crowds and not being penalized as hard for your shots hitting the armor. Now on to the Shard Diffractor. Feedback Loop reduces your ammo but increases the AoE damage and radius of the beam as you continue firing. Spec for maximum duration, these bonuses can stack pretty high, making it a great swarm wipe for clearing out masses of grunts. It's not quite as good against tough targets, but it's still workable. The ammo penalty is pretty steep and you'll have to ration it carefully, but if you can get it right, it's a pretty potent crowd clearer while it lasts. Plascrete Catalyst doubles your AoE damage and radius while shooting at a platform, and if you shoot at a platform for long enough, it creates a massive explosion that deals huge damage to anything nearby. In return, you have a slower beam recharge and slightly less ammo. This is similarly a great swarm wiper, with practical applications all the way up through tougher targets with the immense damage of the explosion. The catch is that it requires a lot of forethought or weapon switching to get platforms down in the places that you need them. It's not too much of a hassle, but the bigger issue is that the explosion has friendly fire, and quite significant friendly fire at that, so just throwing it down at your feet in an emergency isn't going to work as well. It'll probably be less damage than you take from the swarm, but it will still be a lot of damage. Another thing to note is that you don't have to fire all the way to the explosion, you can just take advantage of the double damage and radius and leave the platform intact, though with the slower recharge it can be a bit cumbersome. All said, this is a higher skill floor but higher return way of clearing out swarms. Automated Beam Controller gives you a lot more ammo and makes the beam fire and recharge faster while reducing your mag size and making the beam fire continuously until the mag is depleted. This is a decent overclock if you'd like to ration your use of the diffractor, but for a different reason than ammo. It's safe to say that ammo isn't really a concern anymore with these benefits, but you still need to ration when to use the weapon because using it on a small crowd or weak enemy will waste a lot of charge. Unlike other overclocks, this one doesn't really favor single target or crowd control. It boosts both evenly and pretty well to boot, so this could be a great pick for people who want a hybrid build. It's worth noting that you can cancel the firing by switching weapons and other similar methods, but upon doing so you lose half the charge, so it's not free. If you can get into positions where there are enough or strong enough enemies to make full use of the beam, this is a great overclock to try. Overdrive Booster gives you the ability to hit the reload key while firing to activate an overdrive boost. This causes the beam to fire until depleted with a much higher damage output while reducing your movement speed and causing a longer recharge. Despite what the devs may believe, this is basically a clean in disguise. If you don't use the boost, then it doesn't affect the gun at all. Of course, it also doesn't positively affect the gun either. The boost itself is extremely powerful. Anything you point it at just vanishes, and it tears through dreadnoughts like they're tissue paper. It can be a bit risky to use due to the much slower move speed while boosting, and once again you lose half the mag if you try to cancel the beam early, but if you can get into a position where the full beam is useful, it can make short work of basically anything. This is probably the strongest burst damage overclock the Shard Diffractor has. Volatile Impact Reactor reduces your AoE size and mag size, but makes the beam leave damaging magma behind. In my new weapon review video on the Diffractor, I called this Sticky Flames the Overclock, and that's still a pretty good summary. The Overclock basically just adds Sticky Flames to the Diffractor, making it better at defensive plays against large hordes, while making it slightly worse at dealing with crowds in the conventional way. Overall, it doesn't harm the weapon much, and the bonuses it provides are powerful if you can be proactive enough to utilize them properly. It's also a great source of heat for any builds that synergize with burning enemies. And finally, efficiency tweaks, the Shard Diffractor's 1 clean. This gives you a bit more ammo and mag size. It's a small but noticeable boost in both departments, letting you fire for longer both in the short and the long term. The extra mag size in particular can help get through particularly tough patches of enemies while still having the recharge upgrade, and extra ammo is always welcome. And that's every overclock for the LOK-1 and Shard Diffractor. Both are ammo light but can pack a punch if you use them correctly. Had you going for a minute there, didn't I?